Well, we know there's been explosive growth in passive investing, but when you're looking at the difference between passive and active, which strategy is the best for you? CTV's chief financial commentator, Patty Levitt-Reid, spoke with Sadia, Adatia, chief investment officer at Sun Life Global Investments, about the differences between the two strategies and who they're most suitable for.
When you're trying to get a passive exposure, you're trying to get an exposure to a full market as an example. So if you're looking at Canada, you want a full market exposure to the TSX as an example, with no other constraints, no risk management, just purely the exposure. On the active side, you're selecting within that market, try to find out the stocks that actually have maybe a better risk-reward trade-off, and therefore going for certain exposures within a particular market. So that really is the difference between active and passive.
Now, one of the big differences I will note is the cost.
Absolutely.
When you're buying a basket versus individual stock picking, it's going to cost you more for supposedly the specialization.
Yeah, so in passive, really, there's no skill. You're just picking a blanket index, and you're trying to match that, so therefore it's very cost effective. On the active side, there is some skill, there's some analysis done, and again, there's risk management that's put in place as well to really help you predominantly, avoid the big pitfalls in the markets, and therefore you pay an additional cost for that. And the way to look at those two really is, let's look at the returns net of fees to say what actually is better.
Where are you getting your biggest bang for your buck?
Yeah, exactly. And today, I would lean more towards the active side, but that's not always the case. It really depends on which geography you're talking about, what sort of environment you're facing, and really what is your objective. That is the key part. If you just want, the broad market exposure, passive is completely fine. But if you do want to have something that's aiming for a goal, a particular return profile, then you need to go active because you need to get to that goal, and passive just doesn't get you right there.
So it's not necessarily then, the way I understand it, an either or. It can be an and. You could have both incorporated into your portfolio.
Yeah, that's exactly how we feel. You have passive shops that will say it's all passive, active shops that will say active. We're actually unbiased between the two. And I think you have a broader tool set. Why wouldn't you use both of them? And that, to me, is a better strategy.
So I'm an investor, and I'm developing the composition of my portfolio. I understand asset allocation. I don't want all of my eggs in one basket. But then how do I go about then incorporating both into a portfolio?
Yeah, so you have to look at each geography. So we'll use the U.S. as an example. It tends to be a very efficient market. So you can do a lot of analysis in the U.S. market, but the marginal impact of being able to outperform is a lot lower because everything is kind of priced into the marketplace. Contrast that to the emerging markets, where not as many people follow that market. There's a lot more inefficiencies, and doing additional research does actually add more value. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody in the emerging market space will outperform or everybody in the U.S. market will underperform. So you really have to be specific on which manager you're actually using and then decide. You may want to have a growth bias as an example, in which case you might want to go more active because now you can go away from the benchmark and pick particular stocks that have more representation around the world potentially. Or you can be more defensive and look for things that have good dividends, a strong balance sheet, and those characteristics, you're going to focus more on in active than you would purely on passive.
Now, when you're going to go through that sort of exercise, where would you go to see who the top performers are, and what criteria would you look at over what time frame?
Yeah, so Sun Life has a really big database of investment managers around the world. So we look over 4,000 money managers. And in that, we look at all these different criteria. So obviously, we look at what the firm looks like, what does the people investing in that market look like, how are they paid, as an example, what are their philosophies and process, and very important, again, is risk management. And how do they make sure that they're not overly stuck to one name or they're diversified across the portfolio. All those things that you would actually need to make sure that you outperform over a long period of time, but consistently as well. And that is the real difference between looking just at a broad base of active managers and trying to compare them against the benchmark versus really picking a selective few that actually have the skill set in that market.
So when you talk a long period of time, what period are you talking?
We think a market cycle. Normally that's 4 or 5 years, right? Because you tend to have the ups and downs along the way. And active management probably would kind of truncate those ups and downs, make it a more smoother ride. And again, if you have a market that is overly concentrated, like Canada, as an example, you try to get away from that overly exposed to financials, the mining sector, and energy sector, and get more diversified there.
So your best piece of advice for someone that's saying, okay, I like what he has to say, I'm going to start. What do you do?
So if you're looking at that, what the first thing you have to do is find somebody who actually is, again, unbiased between the two. Look for that manager to be able to deploy the capital in those markets, and then also be able to adjust that over time. Because again, if we say, as example, Canadian fixed income, you want to be passive originally. In this environment, you probably don't want to be, because you're going to be looking at different interest rate environments. If you get the benchmark, you get a high duration, which means highly susceptible to higher interest rates. And so you also want to have credit exposure, which you don't have as much of in the benchmark. So you have to have a manager that's going to be able to be agnostic between the two, and then be able to adjust that over time depending on what's going on in the markets.
So we'll summarize by, it's not an either or, it's an and, but do your homework.
Absolutely. Have as big of a tool set as you possibly can. Do your homework, pick the right managers to do a combination of that. And again, if you have both of them in place, it probably is a better strategy than just one alone.